Welcome back, Wonders. It's Naidra. Now that I'm back, I've been messing around with all of the different character classes and have been having a lot of fun with all of them. For today, I'm bringing to you guys an updated version of the red and green flash from last season. This has been working really well against AoE. I will say the opportunity for this one is, well, it's not a barbarian, so we're not getting to hit level 150 with this, but we are easily able to handle pretty much all endgame content, and we can do pit tiers 100. We can get up to 110, but once you get closer to 110, it does require ads for the bosses in order to be able to take them down, which makes it a little bit challenging, but otherwise, anything up to level 100 is pretty easy to do, and you should be able to do pretty quick. So for today, I'm going to show you guys what this looks like. We'll go into a demo, and then as usual, we'll take a look at our equipment, our skill tree, and everything else as well. Before we dive into it though, if you guys have not yet subscribed to the channel, please don't forget to do so below. All right, let's go ahead and jump right in. Alrighty, so the way that this build is going to work is first we're going to activate our ultimate skill, which is a Devourer. We are dealing a lot of damage with this, and we are dealing poison damage with this, so we are going to be taking advantage of the buffs that we're getting with this specifically. In addition to that, we're going to be activating Toxic Skin. A majority of the damage is coming from Toxic Skin and from our Devourer, so these must stay active at all times or whenever possible. And then we also then will activate our defensives, including Scourge. Each one of these is going to increase the total amount of damage that we're dealing, so it is very, very important that whenever these become available, we're using them as frequently as possible. Now, the purpose of Rushing Claw, there's two things. One is we are getting to our enemies a little bit quicker, so it allows us to be a little bit more agile and more mobile, getting to our enemies, making sure they're going down pretty quick. And because we are using the Centipede Spirit Hall, this does turn this into a Centipede skill as well, which means it is taking advantage of the poison damage as well. It is dealing poison damage, which can explode. Majority of the damage is not going to be coming from that, but it's just an additional damage that we're getting on top of everything else that we're doing. So now that you know how it works, let me show you guys what it looks like. And then once again, we'll go back and see what's making this work. And as you guys can see, I clicked a couple of times and then I just let Toxic Skin kind of do the rest of the work. So that's pretty much how this build is going to work. We do have Vortex on our runes so that we can constantly be pulling our enemies in and then constantly dealing damage to them as well. If you're going up against enemies that are a little bit more difficult or maybe elite enemies, that's when we want to make sure that we're getting them to hit our poison, including the poison trail that we leave behind, as a lot of the damage that we deal will come from that as well. But once you're in full effect, if you look at your Toxic Skin and your Devourer damage that you're dealing, for example, our Toxic Skin is going all the way up to 9 million damage per hit that we're doing, which is quite incredible. And then because of our witch powers and our occult powers, this allows our poison to deal damage 50% faster than it normally would, even though it is a damage over time effect. So this is how this build works. Like I mentioned, we're just really zooming through our enemies pretty quickly, and you really don't even have to stand there because they will eventually die as long as you had your Toxic Skin on, but makes it super quick, super easy, and it is a lot of fun to play. But like I mentioned, be aware, this build is only capable of handling pit tiers up to level 110. So with that said, let's go back to town and take a look and see what's making this work. Alright, so first off, we'll take a look at our equipment, and I do want to point out that this build will get better in time as we fully optimize this. Right now, we don't have anything fully masterworked with the exception of our Shaco, but everything else still has some opportunity to be masterworked a little bit higher, which can also deal quite a bit more damage than we're currently at right now. So even with it not being fully optimized, it's still doing pretty good, but I'll show you where this can get better as we go through the build. So starting off with our weapon, we are using a regular legendary weapon. We were using the Whoosh Knock Pop before, but we are missing out on a lot of critical strike damage, and we're also missing out on a lot of vulnerable damage by not using this. So with this, we're going to be using the redirected force aspect. When we look at the stats, we want to make sure we've got dexterity, maximum life, and either vulnerable damage or critical strike damage for our third stat. Now I'm using vulnerable damage because I got one that's got a GA on it, and we are dealing quite a bit of vulnerable damage, so that still works. And then when we're looking at our tempers, we want to temper on critical strike damage, and we also want to temper on Ravenous, as that is dealing 25% times more damage, and when we're attacking healthy enemies, it's doing up to 50% additional damage, so really important to have this tempered on. Now, when we look at masterworking, if you can get all 3 hits into Ravenous, that's great. If not, critical strike damage will be just as helpful as well, as again, we are relying on a lot of crit strike damage to deal a majority of the damage that we're doing. Next up, we've got our boots, and I do want to preface this by saying I made a very rookie mistake and accidentally salvaged my boots that had a GA on toxic skin, so very, very disappointed. Was a very sad day for me. However, for our boots, we want to make sure we're using Binding Morris. Then for our stats, we want to have movement speed. We absolutely need to have resistance to all elements. So if you can get one that's got a G on it, that'll be great. One of the biggest opportunities with this build is going to be our overall resistances. However, because we're moving so quickly, typically we won't have too much of an issue with that. And then of course, lastly, we do absolutely need to have toxic skin on here. If you can get one with a GA, that's going to be able to deal the most amount of damage for this build. So really, really good to have. But if not, then you can get what I have here. And then for our tempering, we're going to temper on barrier generation and we're going to temper on rushing claw charges. If you can't get the rushing claw charges, that's fine. But right now, with the amount of rushing claw charges that we have is really the sweet spot. We need to be at least at about 15 or 16 in order to make sure that we never run out. And the way that it is right now, I never have a problem. I've got unlimited rushing claw charges, which means I'm not really in one place for more than a couple of seconds at a time. And then, of course, I'm sure you already guessed it, for our masterworking, we're going to masterwork all 3 points into toxic skin. We need to take that up as high as we possibly can. Next up, we've got our pants. So as usual, we will be using the interdiction aspect. I have tried other aspects as well in replacement for this one. However, the amount of block chance that we're getting, and in addition, critical strike damage we're getting from this specific aspect is too good for us not to take. So we will be taking the interdiction aspect. We need to make sure we're getting dexterity, maximum life, and we need to get as much armor as we possibly can with this build as well. The cap for it should be 5,000. The minimum to make this work will be about 3,500. So absolutely have to have a good amount of armor. Yes, the armor cap is at 1,000 for your defensive part of it. However, we are using the unyielding hits aspect with this, and in order to take full advantage of it, we need to have about 5,000 armor or so. Now then, with that said, for our tempers, we're getting barrier generation, we're getting total armor on here as well. If you've already got more barrier generation than I do, then you can replace the barrier generation option for vortex size instead. And then when we're looking at masterworking, we want to masterwork as much as we can into total armor so that we can get closer to that 5,000 mark. Next up, we've got our gloves. For our gloves, we are using the Fell Soothsayer aspect, and that's what's allowing us to deal even more area damage than we're currently dealing with this build. So really important to have. In addition to that, a majority of our vulnerable is coming from here. We are using 3 incarnate skills, and each one of those will cause our enemies to become vulnerable. So that's also super helpful as well. Looking at the stats, we're going to take maximum life, we need more armor, and we're also going to take crit strike damage, with our tempers being barrier generation and, once again, some more critical strike damage as well. When you're masterworking your equipment, we want to try to masterwork critical strike damage, and preferably the tempered critical strike damage, as that's going to give you a bigger boost than the regular critical strike damage that we have at the top here. Next up, we've got our chest armor. We are using Shroud of False Death for our chest armor. The +1 to all of our passive skills is strong, so really good to have. We don't care too much about a majority of the other stats on here, but the 1 to passives is really good. If you're having survivability issues, you can replace this with Tyrael's Might, but this is going to help you with the overall damage. So if you're not struggling to survive, definitely go with the Shroud of False Death. And then, of course, for our headpiece, we are going to be using a Shaco. And there's 2 different reasons we're using the Shaco. One is we're getting about 50% cooldown reduction if you've got a GA on cooldown. And in addition to that, we're getting +4 to all ranks, which we desperately need, especially for our toxic skin. So we can't replace this with anything else. I have tried Loyalty's Mantle, and that does take you pretty far, but it does not allow you to get into pit tiers level 100 or higher, as it does significantly reduce the amount of damage that we're doing. And then, of course, the 20% damage reduction, we'll take as much of that as we possibly can as well. Next up, we've got our amulet. For our amulet, we're using the conceited aspect. We have a barrier on all of the time, which means we're getting up to 45% additional damage all of the time as well. And then for our stats, we're taking dexterity. We absolutely need to have the additional total armor, and we need more cooldown reduction as well, so we can keep everything going a little bit smoother and a lot quicker as well. we're going to temper on critical strike damage, and we're also going to temper on some additional rushing claw charges. Once again, the sweet spot for our rushing claw charges is around 15 or more. When we're looking at masterworking, if your armor is already at 5,000, I would recommend masterworking your cooldown reduction. If you're not, then put as many points as you need to into your total armor until you can get up to 5,000 so we can deal the maximum amount of damage. And then for our ring, we are using Wound Drinker. Wound Drinker gives us an additional +7 to Toxic Skin. And right now I've only got 2 hits of Masterworking on here. So if we can get one additional one, that would potentially bring us up to 8, which once again is going to give us more damage. And not to mention that we're also getting some damage reduction. And additionally, we're getting damage to poisoned enemies. As you already know, our enemies are always going to be poisoned, which means we just have that much more damage that we're going to be dealing to them because of this. And then lastly, for our second ring, for this one, once again, another piece of equipment that I have a lot of area of opportunity for. I was unable to get the right tempers for this one, unfortunately. However, we want to make sure we're taking the unyielding hits aspect. This is where we're getting a lot more damage output as well. So really important to have this. And then for our stats, we're taking dexterity, critical strike chance, and critical strike damage, where we want to temper on critical strike damage as well. And then if possible, we want incarnate cooldown reduction, so that way our toxic skin and also our defensives can reset a little bit quicker, allowing us once again to continuously be casting skills. So with that, once you have all of those on here, we want to masterwork as many points as we can into critical strike damage. And once again, preferably the tempered on critical strike damage, so we can take full advantage of that. And then when we look at our gems and our runes, we are going to be using the emeralds for our weapon. We're also going to be using emeralds for our pants. And then for our chest armor, we're going to throw on the money and Zik rune. For our helmet, we're going to be using the Yule and Cry rune. Once again, this is what's going to be casting that vortex skill. And in order for us to have room for Scourge down at the bottom on our skill bar, we need to have some form of vortex happening and pulling enemies in. And then for our amulet and rings, we need to have Friend of the Bog socketed in our amulet. And then for our 2 rings, we need Toadling's Wish and Vulture Talon. With that said, let's go ahead and take a look at our witch powers. For our witch powers, we are using Pyranado for our unique witch power. This is really helpful because not only are we dealing a tremendous amount of damage with this, but we are also pulling enemies towards the Pyranado itself. And then we are using Soul Harvest with this, Hex of Whispers. We've got Aura of Siphoning, got Aura Specialization, and then lastly, Decay Augmentation. Now, ideally, we want to have all of our witch powers ranked up to level 20, and then for our unique power, we want that to be at level 5. Taking a look at our spirit hall, we are taking Centipede for our primary spirit. Now, the purpose of this is A, making all of our skills Centipede skills, which is great. And then B, it's allowing us to deal additional poison damage with all of our skills that we're using. And this stacks up to 8 times, which means we're doing 23 times 8 damage whenever we're using any of our Centipede skills. And as you can see, we've got 19 rushing claws, so we're constantly casting additional Centipede skills, not to mention everything else that we have on the bar as well. So this is really strong and helps with our overall poison damage. And because of our skill tree, our poison damage also explodes, dealing additional area damage too. For our secondary spirit, we are using Gorilla. This gives us some additional resolve stacks, and the more resolve stacks we have, the more block chance we have, and the more block chance we have, the higher our critical strike damage is going to be. So it all works really well together, but this is the best secondary spirit hall choice we have at this time. And then taking a look at our skill tree, we don't really care which basic skill we're taking here. However, I took Withering Fist because when I first started this build, I actually was using Withering Fist. It was really helpful, but at this point, we no longer need that. So we just need to have enough points to be able to make it down. Now, we're also not using any core skills either. So we just need to take enough points to get us down to the focus skills. For our focus skills, we're taking 1 point into Mirage. We're going to be taking 3 points in Unrestrained Power. On the left-hand side, we're taking 1 point into Focal Point and 3 points into Apex. Now, because the majority of the damage that we're dealing is coming through Toxic Skin, naturally, we're going to be taking 5 points into Toxic Skin, taking it down to Enhanced Toxic Skin, and then finishing it up with Measured Toxic Skin. Now, like I mentioned, once you're in full effect and you're attacking your enemies, the amount of damage that we're dealing from Toxic Skin's poisoning damage can go up to 10 million. So it's doing a lot of damage just with this specific skill. And then of course, everything else is just going to be in addition to it. But we want to have at least 20 points into Toxic Skin. But if we can get higher than that, it's going to take us even further than where we're currently at with this. Moving on down to our defensive skills, we are going to be taking 1 point into Armored Hide. And then we're going to take it up to Enhanced Armored Hide. We also will be taking 1 point into Concussive Stomp, and then taking it up to Enhanced Concussive Stomp. Now, we don't have Concussive Stomp on our actual skill bar, but we are using runes that will invoke this skill, so we do want to make sure we're taking full advantage of it. And of course, it never hurts to have some additional barrier, especially considering we are getting some additional damage from the conceited aspect when we have a barrier on, so this is really helpful as well. We are also going to be taking counterattack, taking it down to counterattack enhancement, and then finishing it up with reinforced counterattack. Next up, we've got 1 point into Scourge, and then we're going to take it down to Enhanced Scourge. And then moving on over to the right, we're going to be taking 2 points into Anti-Venom and taking 3 points into Nourishment. And then on the right-hand side, we've got 1 point into Patient Guard and 3 points into Auspicious. Moving on down to our potency skills, we're going to be taking 3 points into Resilient. Now, we are using Armored Hide and Concussive Stomp, and both of those do count as Guerrilla skills, and they are being triggered pretty frequently, so that does allow us to take advantage of that 20% times additional maximum life when we're using this. And then we only want 1 point into Rushing Claw, as like I mentioned, the damage is not necessarily coming from Rushing Claw. This is just mostly for the mobility part of it, but we are dealing damage thanks to Toxic Skin and thanks to this now being a Centipede skill as well. So we don't need to waste our points here, but we do want to take it up to Enhanced Rushing Claw and then finishing it up with Invasive Rushing Claw. Next up, we're going to take 3 points into Potent. We also will be taking 3 points into Ravenous and 3 points into Oppressive. We'll then move on down to our ultimate skills, where we will be taking 3 points into Resolution. We'll take it on up to Spiritual Attunement for 1 point, and then 3 points into Supremacy. We also want to take 1 point into Sustenance, only so we can make our way over to Intricacy, which we're only going to be taking 1 point for, but this is helpful in recharging our Rushing Claw charges, and that's what's allowing us to have basically unlimited Rushing Claw charges as long as we have that 15 plus. And then we'll wrap it up with the Devourer for our ultimate skill. For the first time, we're using the Devourer, and this is dealing quite a bit of damage. This also goes into the millions once you've cast this along with your other skill as well. A lot of damage that we're dealing from the Devourer. And then we're going to take this on down to Harmonious Devourer and finish it up with Exalted Devourer. And then for our key passive, because this is a poison build, we are taking advantage of Noxious Resonance, so we will be taking 1 point into that. Now, jumping on over to our Paragon board, for our first board, we will be taking the Canny Glyph. And in the beginning, we just want to take just enough intelligence so that we can activate this, and then we'll move on up. Once you've gotten all 5 boards, you can circle back to this and grab the additional intelligence to maximize on the amount of non-physical damage we're getting from this. But we just want to activate the additional bonus before we come back and grab more intelligence. We'll then move on over to our second board, which is going to be the Bitter Medicine board. And we're going to pair this one up with the Spirit Glyph. We'll then jump over to our third board on the right-hand side, which is going to be Viscous Shield. And this one, we're going to be pairing up with the Menagerist Glyph. And then for our fourth board, we'll move on back over to the top left, which is going to be the Convergence board. And this one, we're going to be pairing up with the Bane Glyph. And then our fifth and final board will be the Drive board. And this one, we're going to be pairing up with the Faster Glyph. Now, once you've gotten all 5 boards, then you want to maximize on the surrounding area and grab as many nodes as you can to make sure that you're fully powering up your glyphs. So we want to take all the strength that we possibly can around here. And then, of course, we also want to make sure that we're grabbing these additional non-physical damage nodes. In addition, we'll eventually circle back to this additional armor node as well. And then with that, we'll jump into our Mercenary. For our Mercenary, we are going to be taking Rahir, which is going to be using Ground Slam. We'll then take it down to Rahir's Aegis, following up with Bastion, and finally Inspiration. For our reinforcement, we're going to be taking Varyana, who's going to be using Bloodthirst, and this we're going to pair up with Rushing Claw. Alright, with that said, that's all I have for you guys for today. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I do plan to put out one more Spiritborn build within the next couple of weeks here, but like I mentioned, I am playing around with the other characters as well, and it's been a lot of fun doing so. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you guys like this video, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below. With that said, I'll catch you next time, Wanderers.